Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. It's a joy to be with you on this live stream entitled How Neo-Atheism Glosses Over the Question of Spiritual Being. So, dealing with a worldview represented in various thinkers and writers over the past 20 to 50 years, especially. Thinking of Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, figures like this. For example, Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. I think Alistair McGrath deals with Dawkins head on very well in this very rich dialogue that takes place there. And so I'm not trying to just repeat what a theologian like Alistair McGrath has done, but what I want to do is draw again from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, in chapter 2, beginning a kind of sustained reflection, discussion on the question of spiritual being and related questions like what is spirit? What is spiritual being? Not just as a theological concept or term, but a philosophical question too. What is spiritual being in relation to material being? What is this integral relationship between spirit and matter? So I want to think along with the work of Edith Stein on this question, who I think in her major works, Finite and Eternal Being, as well as Potency and Act, just works out a tremendous philosophy and moreover theology of spiritual being. So this is an incredible question to be asking. And I want to begin with a poem by Edith Stein that she wrote for the Feast of Pentecost in the Catholic Church. She herself was at one point in her life atheist, stopped praying, was not convinced that God was real for many years in her teenage years into her young adulthood. But as she continued to seek the truth and study many subject matters, above all philosophy, it drew her to the reality of God, the nature of God, God as pure spirit. And realities like the human soul, which are also spiritual realities. So this poem by Edith Stein. Who are you, sweet light that fills me and illuminates the darkness of my heart? You who likewise lead me with a mother's hand, and were you to leave me, no further step would I go. You are the space which encompasses round my being and holds it within itself. Dismissed from you, it sinks into the abyss of nothing, from which you raised it to the light. You, nearer to me than I am to myself, and more inward than my innermost heart, and yet impalpable and incomprehensible, and has burst asunder every name. Holy Spirit, eternal love. This is a passage from a poem by Edith Stein, ultimately speaking about God the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. And we hear some reference there to St. Augustine, this more interior than my innermost self. And so when we're talking about spiritual being, what we're getting at from the start is a distinction between interiority and exteriority. This distinction between interiority and exteriority. If there is an exterior world In relation to the self, it implies an interior one from which the self is experiencing the world. So phenomenology gets at this with the concept of consciousness. And we have this interiority, this spiritual life, this life world, this Lebenswelt, we say in German, in relation to the exteriority of the world that gives itself to consciousness, to conscious life. So this is a general starting point when we're talking about spirit, spiritual being, spirit from a Latin verb, spirare, that means to breathe. In a sense, much more um, broad, much more broad than a biological phenomenon of respiration. This is one way we're talking about breathing, but spirit in terms of breathing consciously, breathing in the world, a receptivity to the givenness and signification of all phenomena that light up consciousness. So there are these poles of lived experience, interiority and exteriority. Spirit is something of interiority. What we're talking about, something like the human soul that breathes meaning, that breathes purpose, that breathes motivation, that breathes, again, the givenness and signification of all phenomena that interact with the self. Phenomenology would think in these terms. Metaphysics, for its part, will contrast spirit with the exteriority of matter, what we mean by matter. So I want to spend quite a bit of time in the days ahead talking about these distinctions between spirit and matter, spiritual being and material being, the different types of spiritual being, and contrast this holistic metaphysics and phenomenology with the kind of narratives we find in neo-atheist worldviews, atheistic worldviews in general, that essentially disqualify the meaning of spirit, let alone the substance of spirit, and just deal with matter, just deal with things exteriorly, all the while assuming the interiority of the observer, but not dealing with it. But philosophy must deal with the interiority of the observer without reducing it to more concepts, categories, and data of exteriority. That would be a reductionism of the interior to the exterior. And we're not going to do that in a comprehensive philosophy. So we wanted to think, again, especially with Edith Stein and her work, her reflections on spiritual being through classical metaphysics and contemporary phenomenology. The intellectual fate of Christian theology in the postmodern era depends entirely on a critical articulation of its pneumatology. So this is a key word to think about the science of spirit from the Greek words pneuma and logos. So what we are attempting here is a pneumatology, not just discussion of God the Holy Spirit, who is called pneuma, Hagios pneuma, the Holy Spirit, but also the science of all spiritual being, whether we're talking about divine spirit, an angelic spirit, or a human soul, or even form in relation to matter, eidetic objects in relation to material instantiations of the plurality of forms. So this science, this logos of pneumatology, and what I'm arguing here is the fate of Christianity, of Christian theology, among other world religions depends on its coherent, adequate articulation of pneumatology, of spiritual being. Because if we don't deal with spiritual being, we're confined to the natural sciences, to the worlds of biology, chemistry, physics, technologies, engineering, and we just interpret reality only in these terms. But spiritual being is giving us this whole other side of reality, that upon which all of these exterior data and observations, sense data depend. The interiority of the self, the rational self. If a scientific account of spirit cannot be submitted adequately, Christian theology may very well be banished with good reason from the sphere of serious public discourse. For the postmodern intellect demands evidence, and a lack of evidence equates to lack of relevance. Among the prospective sources for developing a Christian critical pneumatology, the work of Edith Stein is among those that bear the highest promise. So we want to try to conduct with Edith Stein and others this science of spirit, this Geisteswissenschaft, they say in German, even going back to Wilhelm Dilthey. Geisteswissenschaften, we say in English, the humanities in relation to the Naturwissenschaften, Naturwissenschaften, the natural sciences. So the spiritual sciences in relation to the natural sciences, we are concentrating our analysis always in dialogue with the natural sciences, but developing a more extensive pneumatology and Geisteswissenschaft, science of the spirit, through the methods of phenomenology and metaphysics in particular. So we want to first situate our discussion within the larger context of contemporary polemics in pneumatology. To this end, the general categories and limits of scientific knowledge asserted by various voices in the debate over the reality of spiritual being will be unmasked. And then we want to think about the pattern of the science of the cross, what Edith Stein calls Kreuzeswissenschaft, the science of the cross, in relation to the Geisteswissenschaft, science of spirits, in order to understand the logic of spiritual being. There is a coherent logic about spiritual being that is different than the conatus essendi of nature, the struggle to be, of self-preservation, the fight and flight response, and all of these natural instincts of biological organisms, ourselves included. But what is unique about human beings in terms of rationality, intellect, freedom, the capacity to love and be loved, and all these things, which just depend on the reality of spiritual being. And finally, we want to situate Stein's pneumatology within this overall matrix of finite and eternal being, and bring in other metaphysical concepts like form, act, cause, substance, these kinds of things in relation to those things that define material being. So today there are two predominant positions that exist regarding the idea of pneumatology. The first position typically couches its discourse about spirits in an amalgam of confessional metaphorical terms, all of which elude the demand for concrete evidence, especially philosophical evidence, of spiritual reality. So we could quote so much scripture, whether Hebrew scripture, Greek Christian scriptures, that we find the language of ruach in Hebrew. We can translate spirit, wind, breath, or the Greek word pneuma, that we also has a connotation of spirit and breath. And we could quote all these sacred texts and say, there it is, spiritual being. We have it in the tradition. And that's what tends to happen within theology. It's taken for granted. But philosophy and this critical thinking, trying to move with Paul Ricoeur from a place of naivete through critique to a post-naivete about spiritual being, we have to take time to really try to think about what it is through these well-developed philosophical methods of classical metaphysics and contemporary phenomenology. I think these methods give us the best approach to spiritual being, spiritual reality. So even though there is nothing inherently out of place with such a confessional project speaking about spirit within a particular religious milieu, it must be admitted that it blushes before the demands of critical public discourse in a post-Christendom world. Fortunately, we have another position that regards spirit as a fictitious construct, a residue of primitive religiosity sustained by the unenlightened masses of people who continue to enlist spirit as their top-selling opium. So I said, fortunately, we have another position, only to critique it here. But it calls into question, even through a very involved hermeneutics of suspicion, this language of spirits within religious traditions. And this is the neo-atheist position, which casts suspicion on this language of spirit, God as spirit, the human soul something of spirit, an angel, some kind of finite personal spiritual being. The neo-atheist movement puts boundaries on reality according to the purview of natural science, the grammar, the methods of observation, data measurement of natural science. And so is very suspicious of this theologumena that would involve the language of spirit. The neo-atheist movement would treat spirit as an empty concept, doesn't take it seriously. So in the title of this live stream, that's why I say neo-atheism glosses over even the question of spiritual being. It's not taken seriously. It's dismissed from the word go. While biblical metaphors for spirit abound, for example, wind, breath, fire, water, dove, power, life, none of these metaphors qualify as adequate evidence for a verifiable reality of spirit as such. Christian theology understands God to be pure spirit. Therefore, as spirit goes, so goes divinity. So if we don't have an adequate understanding of what is spiritual being, neither do we have any kind of philosophical understanding of what is God, let alone who is God, if there is God. So the account we give of the question, what is spirit? What is spiritual being? Belief in the existence of God depends on how we answer this question. Because God, surely, by definition, is not made of atoms, is immaterial by definition. So if God is not matter, what is God? If the human being cannot be reduced to matter and motion and that is all, what else is the human being? What is the soul? We have to give a serious philosophical account. What is spiritual being? So I just want to reference in passing then from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 370, where we read, in no way is God in man's image. He is neither man nor woman. God is pure spirit, in which there is no place for the difference between the sexes. For God, there is no body as the divine nature. God is not delimited by material boundaries of individual being. Throughout the entire Christian tradition, the eternal deity is portrayed ontologically almost exclusively in terms of spirit, even with all of the anthropomorphizing that goes on in our metaphorical denomination of God. In 1 Corinthians, we read St. Paul saying, "Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." So this would be a biblical motif. God is spirit. And freedom depends on spirit, depends on spiritual being. Edith Stein, in her book, I'm working off a Spanish translation here of the German, La Estructura de la Persona Humana. So the Spanish translation, Dios es espíritu puro, en el que no hay nada de material. So God is pure spirit, in which there is nothing of matter, nothing material about God. Es el ente en el que no hay nada de no ser, es ser puro. God is the being of which there is nothing of non-being. God is pure being, es ser puro, pure being. Espíritu puro, ser puro, acto puro, forma pura. Todo esto es el Dios, una y la misma cosa. Pure spirit, pure being, pure act, pure form. All that is in God is one and the same thing. So this is Edith Stein. I could also give it to you in the German. Gott ist reiner Geist. God is pure spirit. So if God is pure spirit, pure act, pure form, pure being, what is to say? No admixture of matter, of non-being, of potency, of anything corporeal, anything bodily. God is something of a different order than the periodic table of elements, and actually the necessary condition of possibility for there to be a periodic table of elements, things that are in constant flux and change and morphing, and these elements, these atoms and subatomic particles that are participating in a variety of forms in a completely involuntary way. But what is it that gives form to matter at the micro level and the macro level? What is the causality that gives form to matter, that grants it form? That says, this piece of matter for this amount of time is a proton rather than a neutron or an electron. And this form, you are human. And this other one, you are penguin. And this other one, you are orangutan. And this other one, you are parrot. You are mosquito. You are earthworm. You are star. You are iron ore. You are this kind of marble. What is assigning this diversity of forms to matter, to participate in? This incredible mutability of matter, this incredible contingency of matter. What assigns the form to matter? This is what we're asking about in this pneumatology, the science of spirit. But how we understand spirit then is how we might understand divinity. In other words, if spirit holds no rational weight as real, then neither does God, nor angels, nor the human soul. One of the great 20th century pioneers of natural theology was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, this French paleontologist, archaeologist, philosopher, theologian. And Teilhard refused to foist an unwarranted antagonism between spirit and matter. He saw this rift as proceeding from a false dichotomy between religion and natural science. And I use the term natural science. I don't just say science, because science is a very broad term. Theology is a kind of science. In fact, going back to the foundation of the European universities, theology was regarded as the queen of all sciences. And it is to this day. It's the biggest questions we ask, the deepest questions we ask, the most significant, meaningful questions we ask in this science of God, theology. But natural science uh, is the stuff of chemistry, physics, biology, these empirical methods of research and theorizing and data discovery. And they have their respective methods, but they also have their respective boundaries based on the language they're using, the questions they're asking, and how they are manipulating reality in certain terms. So the word science today, though, is often used to refer to something entirely other than things religious, unrelated to religious experience. But, however, if we recall the etymology of the English word science, we're reminded that it signifies any sort of knowledge whatsoever, from the Latin verb sciere, to know, or the Latin noun scientia, knowledge, science, to know something about something. Scientia, knowledge, any kind of knowledge. It's not that the natural sciences have a monopoly on the term science unless we let them have that. So, any discipline to which the suffix logi refers is scientific by virtue of its intrinsic connection to the logos, including and especially theology. So, all of these various fields of study, theology, we have sociology, psychology, biology, paleontology, all of these ologies depend on a common logos, a common ratio, reason, and theology does as well. So theology again was known as the queen of all sciences. It still is very implicitly today. And so it is today and always the case that theology is above and beyond all other fields and has the aptitude responding to the ultimate questions we human beings ask. Okay, so we can get into questions of conversion and repentance and theological questions. They're all very interesting. And we need to go there, but also to ensure that our theology is rational and doesn't drift into some kind of reactionary fundamentalism, we need philosophy. As it's been said, every theology risks of philosophy, risks a philosophical worldview. So we entertain a lot in terms of possibility with phenomenology and in terms of actuality with metaphysics. So we want to think both about the possibilities of spirit and the actuality of spirit with metaphysics, the possibilities with phenomenology. So going back to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who lived from 1881 to 1955, Teilhard refused to foist an unwarranted antagonism between spirit and matter. He saw this rift as proceeding from a false dichotomy between religion and natural science. As a paleontologist and geologist by training, Teilhard insisted that a rapprochement, a togetherness, a conciliation prevail between spirit and matter. Teilhard writes in his book entitled Human Energy, "At the present time, many believers, to avoid the anxieties that contact with reality might renew in them, allow a veil of conventional answers to cover the mysteries of life. And scientists, engrossed in the investigation of detail or caught up by a false materialism, apparently fail to see that by virtue of their discoveries, the fundamental question of the future confronts us in all our activities. Stifled by the words they have invented, men are in danger of losing sight of the problem." They have reached the point of no longer grasping the meaning of what their own experiments are discovering. I think it's just a beautiful, brilliant quote from Teilhard de Chardin. Thinking about we've lost sight of the actual problems at hand, the actual interesting philosophical questions. We've lost sight of meaning. We've entered a point in human history, not for the first time, but again, in new forms and figures of a crisis of meaning, of the ongoing threat of nihilism, of fatalism, of relativism. And philosophy is on guard to avoid all extremisms, all reductionisms. What we want in philosophy is the whole. And Teilhard is a great thinker in this respect. He wants to make a dialogue between spirit and matter, between theology and natural science. And the bridge between the two is philosophy. Philosophy is what all of these ologies, whether again, physiology, psychology, biology, theology, all of these ologies have in common. Philosophy keeps every field accountable to the logos from which it derives its rationality and sense making. So Teilhard, I would suggest, puts his finger on the pulse of the contemporary climate surrounding the relationship between natural science and religion, an ambiguous relationship that persists to this day. Many believers, in particular religious traditions, cower in the face of scientific discoveries, such as the evidence for biological adaptation and evolution. And so we have this camp called creationism, as if the texts of Genesis can't speak to the findings of natural science. But for Catholic thought, this is not a problem. This is not an issue. We love the dialogues to take place between the truths of natural science and all fields of genuine, honest, sincere investigation and the stuff of divine revelation. How do we coordinate all of this together? On the other hand, many so-called scientists raise up false pretenses and brandish arguments against the seriousness of religious experiences and coherent data that point to a transcendent realm of spirit. Some have gone so far as to proclaim that religion and natural science have nothing to say to one another. It's very interesting. When I was writing this book, I sent some of what I was writing, maybe it was this chapter on spiritual being, to a colleague in biology and chemistry at the university where I was teaching. And he looked at the manuscript. After he looked at it, we met each other and crossed paths in the parking lot. And he said, "I'm not sure our disciplines can speak to one another." And I think I, on the other hand, was confident they could speak to one another if we let them, if we simply dialogue, if we try to, the theologian tries to learn more about natural science and the natural scientist tries to learn more about theology and let a dialogue take place. I think oftentimes when it comes to the questions of existence of God and atheist positions, the stuff of theology in relation to natural science, there's a communication breakdown that stops the dialogue, that stops the conversation. And it's really a stoppage of philosophy, a stoppage of meaning making, of questioning. But I go on pursuing these questions very sincerely and transparently about spiritual being because I seek to know the truth about the questions. But a number of recent thinkers have contributed to a growing body of literature collectively referred to as the Neo-Atheism movement. Among the representatives of this movement, I mentioned some in the description of this video: Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, James D. Watson, Christopher Hitchens, Victor Stenger, Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris. And granted, many of these thinkers have a background in natural science, and so their their questions, the way they observe things, the way they receive the data of experience, they're calibrated in a certain way, in a very specified way. And when that happens, it can be difficult to open to different ways of thinking, to a rationalism that expands across the questions we ask. So this neo-atheist movement is sustained by its claim that spirit is not, and therefore God is not. Moreover, this movement makes its onslaught on religion in the name of science, specifically natural science, but typically just the word science is used as if things religious are unscientific by definition. And I would challenge that language game there, that Wittgensteinian language game, where people that are arguing that God doesn't exist in the name of science have a very narrow definition of science, what they mean by science. And I would say theology remains the queen of all sciences based on the questions that are asked and the object of its study, namely divinity. In terms of possibility, in terms of possible data and evidence of divinity, it would be unfair scientifically to rule out from the start any kind of givenness that could come across conscious perception. That's bad science. There will be no cure for cancer if that's how we approach our science, as if we want to curtail possibility according to our own myopic things we already know or think we know. So good science remains with a disposition of openness to the data as they might give themselves through the course of lived experience. And this is what phenomenology will contend over and over. We cannot prematurely close the door on data that may give themselves. We can't already assume we know what the world is. Rather, as good scientists, we have to continue to observe what the world gives. And we can't say for sure what it will give. That's why Desjardins, he's talking about, Teilhard is talking about we need to leave open the possibility of the future, the fundamental question of the future that confronts us in all of our activities. Sure, we have memories of the past, but what might the future bring? What might come? What might the future lived experience give? What might be given therein? This is what philosophy says. We must be open to this. And otherwise, we enter into an ideological stronghold in our discourse. And we're just trying to prove a point. We're just trying to win an argument that we've already made up our mind. But genuine philosophy, going back to the very form of Platonic philosophy, is dialogical. We have so many more questions to ask, to pursue, so many more new things to learn. And especially when it comes to something like the question of spiritual being, that by definition is of a different order than material being, in things that we've mastered so well, and that we not only measure and manipulate, but manufacture. What is this kind of being that does not lend itself to manufacturing? So, the movement of neo-atheism is sustained by its claim that spirit is not, and therefore God is not. Moreover, this movement makes its onslaught on religion in the name of natural science. For example, in his book Quantum Gods, Victor Stenger writes that, quote, "We should see evidence for God in the cosmos, in life on earth, and in human activities. However, using our own senses and the scientific instruments we have developed to aid those senses, we find no evidence for God or any form of supreme spirit." So this is the argument, end quote, of Victor Stenger, who has a background in physics. And I quote this because I want to critique it straight away. Stenger reasons that if spirit is real, it would be observable plainly by the senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, the senses, the physical senses. But do we not detect an issue with the reasoning here? Uh, he reasons that if spirit is real, it would be observable plainly by the senses, even if through the medium of scientific instruments that extend the capacities of the senses for observing sense data, like a microscope, an X-ray, a telescope, electron microscope even. And so he wants it to show up in the visual field, in the oral field. He wants divinity to be made into an object of sense data object. But we may continue to think, for those who presume to leave open the possibility of spiritual reality, Stenger's position, and that of virtually everyone in the Neo-Atheism camp, can be described aptly as a crude materialism that reduces the real to atomic matter and energy alone. That's it. As if Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, the mass energy equivalence equation, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, as if this contains the real energy mass, as if this matrix by itself contains the real. Yet, what if atomic matter and energy receive their being from a primordial giving that gives exhaustively to the point of abandonment, in turn generating finite, transient, contingent, ephemeral, mutable beings? Could there be a flip side to the sensible material world itself, made possible only by an elusive reality of radical self-donation? So that's one way of approaching the concept of divinity, an elusive reality of radical self-donation. So these are the questions we want to consider. We want to attempt to investigate in the light of Edith Stein's work, especially, which answers these questions in the affirmative. So thank you for your comments. Theology, yes, since the beginning of the universities, it's regarded as a science. And if we want to relegate the meaning of science to this world of objects that the senses investigate through sense data, then yes, theology exceeds that limit. But what I'm challenging is our understanding of the very concept of science, which, as I said earlier, is from the Latin verb scire, to know, or scientia, knowledge, to know about anything. All the questions we ask provoke our pursuit of knowledge. We lead with the questions, and we ask so many questions that exceed the aptitude, the capacities of natural sciences. So science has its methods, and even the word method, metahodos, hodos involves a way beyond the aporia, a way that gets us to the causality that is being asked in every why question. And the natural sciences cannot answer adequately the question, which is one for philosophy and moreover theology: why is there something rather than nothing? Biology can't answer it. It doesn't have the grammar, the concepts. It doesn't have the question in its textbooks. Why is there something rather than nothing? So we have our methods in theology too. We have our methods in philosophy. And so, yeah, thank you for your comment. Genesis describing how God, the first thing made in Genesis chapter 1, fiat lux, the Latin version of the Hebrew, let there be light. So as you say, God is outside of the holograph. Um, and this is the point, yes, we're trying to make with Edith Stein in this book, that what we mean by divinity, what we mean by God, is other than the universe. We don't, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we don't believe in pantheism. We don't believe that the universe is God. We don't even believe in a panentheism, that God is beyond the universe, yet the universe is in God, and the universe is part of God or something. But the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, that God creates the universe from nothing, signifies that God is wholly other in relation to the universe, and to wholly other than this world of change, world of becoming, movement of potencies actualized, this flux of finite being and its existence depending on that which does not change, that which is eternal, immutable, and yes, moreover, immaterial, therefore. And this is why we use the language of spirit in both metaphysics and contemporary schools of philosophy like phenomenology. So even if, yes, in theology, our data, we're looking especially at the data of divine revelation, but there's still data, there's still given meanings, they're events, they're historically based. And so science, there is a science of divine revelation. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century calls it sacra scientia, sacred science, which is, yes, sacra doctrina. It depends on what God has revealed as the evidence and the data that we're investigating in the science we call theology. So it's not that theology lacks method or it lacks data to explore, but yes, the doctrines themselves serve as media for the data to come to the observer. Without the teachings, without the traditions, without the sacred texts and everything else, we have we're not doing theology. We're not able to explore divine revelation. But what is divine revelation? It is God's generous, gratuitous self-communication to creatures. And yes, it involves a claim and it involves the intentionality of faith to access and take seriously. But, I've got the Hebrew Christian scriptures here in my hand. And theology is saying, let's investigate them. Let's read them. Let's try to understand what's being said and put things in the historical, cultural context in which they emerged. Let's interpret the text responsibly through all the historical critical methods, literary criticism, archaeology, and then also philosophical theology, all the senses of the text, both literal and spiritual senses of the text, all the figurative meanings, allegorical, anagogical, tropological, or moral. This is the science we call theology. We do a lot of heavy lifting there. We take at least the possibility of divinity seriously, and moreover, the possibility of God's revelation seriously, and we explore it. Why? Because we care about things like love, meaning, responsibility, taking the question of death seriously. What happens when a person dies? We're not content with just a biological explanation. Yes, we consider this, but is there anything else? I'm hoping that this life might go on, and so we begin with a virtue like hope, and we consider not only is it possible, but is it actual? Is it real? This Jesus of Nazareth, did he really rise from the dead? It's yes or no. And we need methods to explore the truth about this. And biology can't answer that. Chemistry can't answer that. Physics can't answer that. All of these various fields can't answer it in themselves, but all together, and then we add philosophy and theology, we can ask a question like this. Did Jesus rise from the dead? What's the evidence? What's the data? What are the testimonies? Okay, so let me try to catch up with your comments here. Okay, so theology, the science of revelation, and yes, it does involve knowledge through faith, knowledge through faith. But it's a rational faith. It's not fideism that doesn't care if it's rational or not. The Judeo-Christian tradition, at least I speak for it, is entirely rational. Um, Even in the beginnings of the universities, the handmaiden of the Queen of all sciences theology was called metaphysics, this ancillary science that supports the rationality of faith. As Anselm of Canterbury, the Benedictine theologian of medieval times, says that theology is a science that can be defined as fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. So we need the philosophy to aid and support the theology. So take this quote: the scientific method is a loosely used general guideline, let's say, of obtaining said knowing through conjecture, experimentation, and observation by interaction with creation. Yeah, I like how you put that. That's, yeah, the scientific method. It has its parameters and its limitations. One need not lenses when we were given perfectly good ones in our face. Um, yeah, okay. So, yeah, we're looking at the truth, and we're looking at the content, the objective content, as well as the subjective reception and response to divine revelation. uh, Faith is blind in a certain sense. But as we read in the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament, chapter 11, verse 1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And yes, as St. Paul says, I walk by faith and not by sight. Uh, so, yeah, this is what we're getting at, seeking the truth about spiritual being, getting beyond the ideological polemics between atheism and theism. The polemics often are unhelpful. They get very sophisticated in terms of their sophism. It's like lawyers wanting to argue one thing or the other just to be right. It's for me, when I explore these topics, it doesn't matter if I have no followers, no subscribers, and nobody thinks I'm right. I want the truth, whether people think I'm right or not. But the truth in itself is right, is correct, is the real. And that's what I'm after. I don't want to win an argument. I don't want to come across as sophisticated and educated and eloquent. And because I'm so eloquent, people believe what I'm saying. That's falsehood. That's illusion. Even Satan masquerades as an angel of light. And that's not how I want to do philosophy. But I want the whole and I want the fullness of truth. So, before taking a closer look at Edith Stein's account of spiritual being, which we'll do especially in live streams to come, it is necessary to recall the brilliant insights of Marianne Sawicki in her book entitled Body, Text, and Science. And in this book, in the 6th chapter, Sawicki talks about science as literacy. She writes that, quote, science is possible at all, according to Edith Stein's account, simply because the bedrock that grounds all cognition is bodily life, immediately available to consciousness. So that's a very deep philosophical thought that Sawicki is getting at, and thinking about the work of Edith Stein. That the bedrock that grounds all cognition is bodily life. Thomas Aquinas says this too, that we have things to think, things to imagine, things to remember because we have bodies. And in our human nature, we're taking in the world, yes, through our senses. As Immanuel Kant said, we cannot imagine anything that in some way we haven't already experienced, even if we're creating a kind of chimera of something like a flying spaghetti monster. We've experienced spaghetti, some notion of monster, and things that fly. And we synthesize these various perceptions in our understanding and our imagination. But the body itself, in its interaction with the world, with the local environment, is what gives us food for thought. So we admit that the bedrock that grounds all cognition is bodily life, immediately available to consciousness. Um, so, yes, this is a very important point. She goes on to say, life is felt as the reciprocal influence and responsiveness of material, sentient, and soulful levels in their openness to intellect. So we have these different categories of how we would describe lived experience through phenomenology. Life is felt as the reciprocal influence, the interaction and responsiveness between our material being, that is our body, and the materiality of phenomena that give themselves through the senses, that are sense data giving themselves. And we sense, we have this sentient um, living being about us. We sense the world, but also the soulful. What's now meant by the soul? Again, this distinction between interiority and exteriority, the flow of the exterior world onto the interiority of the self, this conscious life. We have a distinction here between the data and the perceiver and receiver of the data. Who is this recipient? Who is this beneficiary of all the givenness of phenomena? The self, the ego life, consciousness was what Edith Stein calls the 0 point of orientation of experience. It depends on a stable hermeneutical interiority in relation to the givenness and signification of the world of phenomena that is other than the self. So if we're talking about exteriority, it implies interiority. If we're talking about what is external to the self, it implies the what is internal to the self. So when we're using the language as of soul here, which does not occur much in phenomenology, rather we use the language of consciousness, of we'll see in Husserl even the language of spirit. We're talking about, again, spirit is a term that distinguishes a certain kind of reality from an exterior material one. And exteriority, we can also have spiritual exteriority in terms of ethical relationship or eidetic object that comes into consciousness. So, but in any case, what is happening interiorly with the self? This is getting us to the meaning of spiritual being and its reality. So the interaction between material, sentient, and soulful levels of the lived experience, and all of this open to the intellect that is synthesizing all of these levels within the human experience. So Sawicki, this commentator on Stein, depicts Stein as understanding science as a reading of life, not just biologically, but in terms, going back to Wilhelm Dilthey, um, uh, this Geisteswissenschaften, the spiritual sciences, we call the humanities. Yes, stuff like literature and the arts and history, philosophy, and moving into theology as well. Humanities in relation to what are called the hard sciences because they're dealing with material kinds of data. But what's dealing with spiritual kinds of data? The human sciences, the place of ultimate meaning making and responsiveness to all of these material objects in our lived experience. How do we interpret them, respond to them? Who and what is doing the interpreting? Surely not matter is interpreting itself. No, natural science assumes the alterity of the interpreter in relation to what is being interpreted as objects. And yes, we call this in philosophy subjectivity, and I see it's coming through the comments. But yes, phenomenology also examines the objectivity of subjectivity. the objectivity of subjectivity. Theology is dealing with the objectivity of divine revelation, not reducing divinity and God's revelation to a world of objects, but we're dealing with a world of meanings. And we're also dealing with the fullness of reality, the fullness of the question of being that cannot be reduced to matter. Matter is an aspect. But going back to ancient Greek philosophy, what is more interesting and essential and decisive than matter is form. Eidos in Greek, morphe in Greek. What Plato is talking about. The experience of the transcendentals of the human subject's lived experience of being. Beauty, goodness, truth. We don't find these on the periodic table of elements. The element of truth made up of these atoms? No, it's of a different order within the realm of being. And to speak, to interpret, to observe implies this alterity to matter we call spirit in both metaphysics and phenomenology. So you ask, what is psyche? Psyche is from the Greek word psyche that we would translate soul. So the very field of psychology is meant to be the science of the soul, but Edith Stein says right at the beginning of her book, Finite and Eternal Being, the feat of late 19th century psychology that dispensed with the reality of the soul and became a purely empirical science of the soul in terms of behavioral patterns, neurochemistry, neurobiology. So the paradox and the irony of the field of psychology is it's named after the term for soul. Yes, that we find too in the Christian New Testament. Psyche, soul, but it doesn't even deal with it directly. It doesn't take the spiritual soul seriously because actually the soul is outside, again, the aptitude, the purview, the capacities of psychology and all social behavioral sciences that are confined to empirical methods of research, just like the natural sciences. But again, we need to come back to Wilhelm Dilthey and this whole legacy of the Geisteswissenschaften, the spiritual sciences, the humanities. And we don't want these to be amputated from our university studies, lest we amputate our humanity to the point of non-recognition. So, Wiki depicts Stein as understanding science as a reading of life. Okay, so life, related concepts, psyche in Greek, nephesh in Hebrew, ruach in Hebrew, pneuma in Greek. What else? Anima is a Latin term where we would translate soul. And yes, we do get the word animal, animation, and so on. And we read, yes, as you say, in Genesis chapter 2, about God breathing life into Ha'adam, and he became a living being. God breathing this life into Ha'adam. And we have the play of the name Ha'adam from Ha'adama, which means earth, the dust, the dirt, the mud. God breathes life into man, and he becomes a living being. So this ruach and the adama, the dirt, the clay becomes nefesh, living, and we translate nefesh in English, living being or soul directly, like the Greek psyche. Okay, so to continue on with the reflection. Stein's constant account of the complementarity between body and soul underpins her phenomenological and metaphysical assessment of the human person. While the natural sciences, as I mentioned, biology, chemistry, physics, for example, assume a conscious ground For every manipulation and measurement of atomic matter and energy, phenomenology brings this conscious ground into view as a centerpiece of its own scientific enterprise. Because of Stein's holistic account of human being, various forms of reductive anthropologies are assuaged. For example, those that would pretend to reduce human being to a serendipitous unity of chemical processes, and that is all. Instead, Stein asserts that all scientific literacy, I just love that term, scientific literacy, this science as a reading of life and the interaction between the material components of our being, the sentience, receptivity to the world of material objects, but even more, this in the soulful reception and interpretation of all this data, material and otherwise. Ideas themselves are not material objects. We call them in phenomenology eidetic objects, from the Platonic term eidos, that we would translate form. And an idea, something like happiness, is not made of atoms. And I can't reduce the meaning of happiness to the stuff that natural science will measure and manipulate and gather up as sense data. Happiness has to do with a global constellation of life beyond biological life. But in Greek, there's another word for life, zoe, the life we talk about in the New Testament, the life that Jesus came to bring. It's comprehensive. Philosophy must be comprehensive. It must to commit to this comprehensiveness when asking the question of being in metaphysics or the questions of meaning in phenomenology. So let me catch up with the comments here. Okay. Yeah, thinking about the metaphysical reality of an angel. What is an angel? We're going to get into this in future live streams, but we have to build up to it by first deconstructing the ideological strongholds of worldviews like Neo-Atheism. And we have to deconstruct them, unmask them, call a thing what it is, expose the fact that these arguments are not calling a thing what it is, that they're making categorical mistakes, that they're insisting on if God is real, that God show up in the world of material objects. But God, by definition, is immaterial, so that's not going to happen. If we demand that God be treated like just another datum of natural science, we will be sorely disappointed, and we're not going to find God under the microscope, God through the telescope, not even once we figure out what dark matter is. Oh, that's what God is. No, God, we're talking about an ontological difference that I've talked about in previous live streams between being itself and beings. Divinity is being itself. The essence of divinity, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, is existence. Being itself is the essence of divinity, not a being among beings, but being as verb, esse in Latin, rather than ens, rather than a being. So thank you so much for joining, Dominic. Great to have you here. So the comment, people made up the idea of God to cope with the absurd. Well, yes, God definitely helps us cope with the absurd, and that's a good thing, because absurdity is nihilism, and with nihilism comes fatalism. Without meaning, we might as well expedite our return to nothingness. But in fact, we are a miracle after all. We are something rather than nothing, and we didn't give that something to ourselves. It was caused from an elsewhere than the finite being we experience ourselves to be. And if there is finite, there is infinite. And in fact, the finite depends on it. So philosophy overcomes the temptation to absurdity through the clarity of reason. And moreover, the clarified clarity of reason through divine revelation. So, yes, we are arguing against these neo-atheist positions for sure, because with Edith Stein, we want to read life comprehensively. We want to read life comprehensively, and we want to receive all the meaning that gives itself therein. Sawicki writes elsewhere that Stein's works on empathy and on psychology established that natural science is indeed a cultural achievement, for it rests on the ability to isolate caused data by recognizing and subtracting motivated data from raw data. This is something to really ponder. This subtractive literacy is the most basic scientific competence, and it is fundamentally interpersonal. This basic competency of natural science, which involves the ability to subtract motivated data from raw data in order to get at actual cause data, is coming clean with this very process of observation. Every scientific experiment is designed with motivations in mind. And so we set it up and we conduct the experiments. We run it. We gather the data, we measure them, we manipulate them, we do statistical analysis, but we have our motivations for doing so. And so oftentimes a scientist can mistake motivated data for raw data. I want these to be the data of the experiment, and so I'm going to fudge a bit on my interpretation so that I can argue my point in this article, in my research, or for the sake of doing this statistical study to support a claim that's already been decided. So what Sawicki is getting at is natural science as a cultural achievement. True, genuine natural science rests on this subtractive literacy when one is able, with humility and courage and transparency, to come clean with self-interest and be as disinterested as possible within the questions we're asking and the experiments we're performing and the interpretations of the data within the experiments that we do. And what else is being said here is that we can't pretend like we do science in a robotic, impersonal way. We're persons after all, and our personhood itself is the evidence of spirit, of the otherwise than matter, of the ones who turn and face this world of matter and cannot be reduced to it. So what are we if we're not only matter? We have material bodies. We are spirit. We are soul and matter. As the Catholic Church teaches, anima forma corporis. The soul is the form of the body. Okay, so I'm trying to catch up on the comments. Thanks so much for your participation. Um, uh, See if we can relate anything here. Yes, I love the language, the whole of truth, and the need for the human person to consent to this givenness of truth. Thank you for your question, Dominic. The why is the philosophical inquiry, and the how of the science of inquiry within the thoughts spoken and written after the thoughts. Okay. Yeah, so the difference between classical metaphysics and contemporary phenomenology. Classical metaphysics is asking the question, why? Trying to get at the cause of a thing, the cause of a being, and getting at being itself. Phenomenology prefers to ask how rather than why. How does this phenomenon give itself to me? How does this phenomenon signify itself to me? So phenomenology is the methodology of the how, classical metaphysics, the methodology of the why, as well as the what, and as well as the who when we're getting into personhood and the interpersonal nature of scientific investigation. So maybe just a couple more points for this live stream today. I think Sawicki's point is tremendous. I could continue to think about that for a long time. But this quote about the subtractive literacy as the most basic scientific competence that is fundamentally interpersonal, unmasks the prevailing modern-day cultural assumption that the natural sciences are robotically precise and entirely impersonal. Rather, Sawicki points out the fact that the natural sciences and all sciences, for that matter, pun intended, proceed from the careful task of distinguishing raw, observable, and measurable data from any motivated data that always precede and follow every experiment. Motivated data cause us to set up the experiment a certain way, ask certain questions that often involve tacit self-interest. And then we run the experiment and then go on to interpret the data according to the hermeneutic circle of self-interest. And we're confusing motivated data from raw data. And we don't quite get at actual cause data in the experiment. So that's why we haven't found a cure for cancer, I would suspect, to this day, because this is the kind of stuff going on when we have a commodification of the healthcare industry. But the true scientist, the true philosopher, the true lover, the true theologian will renounce these reductionisms of the saturated phenomena of divinity, of the infinite, of the absolute, of love, of being itself. We will renounce these unwarranted reductionisms. And we will say, no, I am a lover of meaning, and I will not let meaning be taken from me. Good philosophy always carries about the no, the renunciation to the renunciation, the reductionism of the reductionism, to maximize thought, to maximize the horizon of meaning and meaningfulness. We will renounce the eclipse of possibility and the illusion that actuality is man-made. For classical metaphysics, actuality anchors reality. For contemporary descriptive phenomenology, possibility guides the questioning, the investigation, the research, yes, the science of meaning and meaningfulness. As human beings, we must commit to reject the frail and thin and flimsy proposition that God is a lie. We must instead counteract and expose the falsehood of the falsehood and get back to the truth. Edith Stein helps us to do this. So let's think just a couple more points together in today's live stream. So all this is to say that every recognized datum within lived experience, with every scientific experiment, is perceived through multivalent layers of interpretation according to a predetermined structural order of meaning, by which metacognition positions the newly acquired datum in relation to previous knowledge and presuppositions, the hermeneutic circle. It is clear that there is causal motivation for each and every experiment conducted. Every experiment is conducted according to motivative meanings, meaningfulness, intentions, inquiries, and goals, often attached to pay scales and grants and donations. Accurate scientific method implies the intercultural competency of separating wish from fact. Cause data are obtained precisely through the process of sifting raw data from motivated data. This subtractive literacy, in which you're understanding science as this literacy of life or reading of life, as Sawicki names it, is essential for adequate scientific methodology and is inherently interpersonal. It involves a dialogue between self and others, between self and one's self as another. Phenomenology arrives on the scene as the propitious science of science that possesses the aptitude for deciphering not only the difference between raw data and motivated data, but includes the ability to enact a science of consciousness itself, a science of interiority in relation to the exterior world out there, in relation to the interiority of the self. The science of any and all data or givens, the science of meaning. Phenomenology claims not only that a science of human subjectivity and intersubjectivity is possible beyond that of mere epistemology or philosophy of mind, but that it is necessary as the very intellectual ground upon which all subsequent fields of science rest. Going back to Edmund Husserl, to the things themselves, zu den Sachen selbst. Phenomenology has demonstrated sufficiently that all so-called raw data emerge from the givenness of the pure and essential data of consciousness, giving themselves in every act of intuition, that is, in each and every actual phenomenon and in each and every possible phenomenon. It is in the name of the possible, of the impossibility of impossibility, and of the God who makes all things possible that Edith Stein recuperates the apodictic basis of objective truth and the eternal nature of both possibility and actuality that goes before and behind any authentic science worthy of the name. So this is what I wanted to get on the table in this live stream today. In the next one, I want to investigate more what's meant by the science of the cross, the logic of the cross, this paradoxical logic of Christianity that we must understand in order to intuit spiritual being as such. It's going to give itself phenomenologically through a paradoxical logic, a very paradoxical self-revelation vis-a-vis the material order of being. So, thank you all for this great interaction on the chat, this back and forth, lots of questions, lots of great points, and thinking about, the difference between a genuine scientist and a Promethean self-sufficiency and sophism of just arguing what one already thinks is true because one wants it to be true. And I would question if someone wants God not to be real, because that's a pretty sad situation if that's the case. But it doesn't make sense, fortunately, because in the beginning is not death, but life. Death is an interruption of life, but not a complete destruction of life. Death threatens the perpetuity of life, but a moment. And this is where we need a full investigation, not only of meaning, but the data and evidence of divine revelation in relation to reason. And this is where we will find so many interesting data, meaningfulness, and truth that will motivate us in a way that transcends the narrow desires of self-interest and will allow us to be the most proficient scientists and philosophers and theologians possible, because we proceed with an attitude that is not the natural attitude because it's been bracketed by phenomenology, but an attitude of sincere disinterestedness that is expressed through self-donation in a very embodied and incarnate way. The sincerity of the investigation is evinced in the definitiveness of the self-donation, how one lives one's life. Is Jesus not the finest scientist, the finest investigator, the finest philosopher, and the most sincere truth-telling theologian? As gods become human, to reveal theos agape estin, God is love. So thank you all so much for joining me today in this live stream. May we all continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.